The most dangerous man in Europe did not carry a rifle or lead a charge on the front lines. He sat behind a polished desk, playing the violin while calculating how to erase millions of lives with the stroke of a fountain pen. On a warm May morning in 1942, his absolute power was challenged by a piece of jammed metal and a single desperate heartbeat. This is the moment the Butcher of Prague realized that even a god of the New Order could bleed. History remembers Reinhard Heydrich as the man with the iron heart, a figure so cold that even his closest allies felt a chill in his presence. He was the architect of a silence so profound it threatened to swallow the whole of Europe. Yet that silence was about to be shattered by an act of defiance that would change the course of the war and lead to one of the darkest retaliations in human memory. The city of Prague in 1941 was a place of ghosts and shadows. Once known as the Golden City, it had been transformed into the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a crown jewel of the occupation that needed a firm, merciless hand to keep its industry humming for the war machine. Heydrich arrived not as a diplomat, but as a predator hovering over the cobblestones. He was tall, blonde, and possessed a grace that felt lethal, a fencer and a pilot who viewed human empathy as a biological defect. To him, the people of Prague were merely tools to be used, or obstacles to be cleared. Within weeks of his arrival, the local resistance was decimated, and the streets were lined with posters announcing the names of those who had ceased to exist. He called it pacification, but the world knew it as a reign of terror that turned every alleyway into a potential trap. Behind the scenes, in the fog-drenched streets of London, a plan was being forged in the deepest secrecy. It was called Operation Anthropoid. Two men, Jozef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, were chosen for a mission that many considered a one-way trip into the abyss. They were not elite commandos with high-tech gadgets. They were soldiers who carried the weight of their occupied homeland in their chests. They were parachuted into the dark woods of the Protectorate, landing in a landscape where every window could hide an informant and every shadow held a threat. For months, they lived in the margins, moving from safe house to safe house, breathing in the cold air of a city that seemed to be waiting for a spark. They were waiting for the one moment when the man with the iron heart would leave his fortress and become vulnerable. Heydrich was arrogant, a trait that often accompanies the absolute belief in one's own invincibility. He traveled in an open-top green Mercedes, refusing a heavy escort because he believed the local population was too broken, too terrified to ever strike back. He wanted to show the world that he could ride through the heart of occupied territory like a king among subjects. Every morning he took the same route from his villa to the Prague castle, a routine that became a ticking clock for those watching from the shadows. This predictability was the crack in his armor that the resistance had been looking for. They chose a sharp hairpin turn in the suburb of Lidice, where the car would have to slow down to a crawl, making it the perfect kill zone for a desperate gamble. The morning of May 27, 1942, was warm and clear, the kind of day that felt too peaceful for what was about to unfold. Gabčík and Kubiš took their positions, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. Gabčík hid a Sten submachine gun under a raincoat, while Kubiš carried a modified anti-tank grenade in a briefcase. They waited. Minutes felt like hours as the city hummed around them, unaware that the air was thick with the scent of an impending storm. Then the green Mercedes appeared in the distance. It rounded the corner, slowing down just as they had practiced. Gabčík stepped into the road, pulled the raincoat away, and leveled his weapon at the man who had orchestrated the darkest chapters of the era. He pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. In that split second, the world seemed to stop spinning. The silence that followed the metallic click was more terrifying than any explosion. Heydrich, instead of ordering his driver to floor it and escape, stood up in the car and reached for his pistol, his face contorted not with fear, but with an icy outrage that someone would dare to challenge his authority. It was a fatal mistake born of pure ego. Kubiš, seeing the failure of the gun, acted on instinct. He hurled the grenade. It didn't land inside the car, but hit the rear wheel, detonating with a force that sent shrapnel through the chassis and into Heydrich's side. The smoke cleared, and for a moment, the untouchable architect of the occupation was slumped, wounded, and suddenly terrifyingly human. The aftermath was a slow descent into a nightmare. The assassins fled, vanishing into the labyrinthine streets of Prague, while Heydrich was rushed to a hospital. For days, the city held its breath, the tension so thick it felt like a physical weight. The news of the attack sent shockwaves all the way to Berlin, triggering a fury that demanded blood for blood. Martial law was declared, and a massive bounty was placed on the heads of the attackers, turning neighbor against neighbor. But as Heydrich lay in his hospital bed, his body was fighting a different kind of battle. An infection caused by the very horsehair stuffing of his luxury car seats that had been blown into his wounds began to consume him from the inside out. On June 4th, the man with the iron heart finally stopped beating, killed by the debris of his own vanity. What followed was not a victory for the resistance, but a descent into an organized madness that the world struggled to comprehend. The authorities needed a scapegoat, a way to demonstrate that any act of defiance would result in total erasure. They chose a small, quiet village called Lidice. There was no evidence that the villagers had anything to do with the assassination. A single misunderstood letter was all the justification the machinery of the state needed. On the night of June 9th, the village was surrounded. The men were separated from the women and children. By morning, the village of Lidice had been wiped from the face of the earth. Buildings were burned, the rubble was bulldozed, and the name of the town was removed from official maps. It was a message written in fire and ash, intended to prove that the shadow of the butcher was longer than his life. Meanwhile, the hunt for Gabčík and Kubiš reached a fever pitch. They were hiding in the crypt of the Saints Cyril and Methodius Cathedral, a cold underground sanctuary where the air was thick with the smell of old stone and rising desperation. They were not alone. Other paratroopers had joined them, waiting for a way out of a city that was slowly tightening like a noose around their necks. They might have escaped, slipping away into the countryside, if not for a betrayal from within their own ranks. A fellow soldier, broken by the pressure and the fear of the reprisals, walked into a police station and gave up the names of the safe houses. The sanctuary was no longer safe. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. On June 18th, the cathedral was surrounded by hundreds of troops. The battle that followed lasted for hours, a frantic struggle between a handful of men and an army. It was a siege of a sacred space, where the sound of hymns was replaced by the rattle of gunfire and the hiss of water being pumped into the crypt to drown the men inside. The paratroopers fought with everything they had, holding off waves of attackers from a small stone cellar. When their ammunition ran low and the water rose to their chests, they chose their own end rather than surrender to the men waiting above. They had completed their mission, but the cost was etched into the very stones of the city, a price paid in blood and the silence of the dead. The death of Heydrich was a significant blow to the structure of the occupation, but it also revealed a terrifying truth about the nature of power. The man was gone, but the machinery he built continued to grind on, fueled by a desire for vengeance that knew no bounds. The world watched in horror as the reports of Lidice and the subsequent executions filtered out through the cracks in the propaganda. It was a reminder that in the struggle against a certain kind of darkness, there are no clean victories. The butcher was dead, but the scars he left behind would take generations to heal, and some would never fade at all. The mission had succeeded, but it had opened a door to a level of retaliation that redefined the limits of human cruelty. The story of the Butcher of Prague is often told as a tale of heroism, and in many ways it is. It is a story of men who stood up when the world was falling into shadow. But it is also a thriller of the highest order, a series of what-ifs and narrow escapes that could have turned out differently at a dozen different points. If the gun hadn't jammed, if the grenade had missed by an inch, if the betrayal hadn't happened, the map of Europe might look very different today. It is a narrative of cold calculations met by hot-blooded defiance, played out in the fog-drenched streets of a city that has seen too much history to ever truly forget the scent of fear. As the years passed, the ruins of Lidice were turned into a memorial, a place where the wind whistles through the empty space where homes once stood. It serves as a permanent shadow, a reminder of what happens when the mechanics of hatred are allowed to operate without restraint. Heydrich's legacy was not the thousand-year empire he envisioned, but a cautionary tale of how quickly a society can descend into a nightmare when one man's cold logic is allowed to replace the human conscience. The void left by the village is a scream that can still be heard if one listens closely enough to the silence of the plains. The crypt in the cathedral still bears the marks of the bullets and the deep scratches of the men who fought there until the end. Visitors often remark on the heavy silence of the place, a silence that feels as though the walls themselves are holding back the echoes of the gunfire. It is a place of pilgrimage for those who want to understand the true price of freedom. The men who died there were young, far from home, and knew that their actions would likely lead to their own ends. They didn't do it for glory or for the history books. They did it because they believed that some shadows are too dark to be allowed to grow unchallenged, no matter the cost to themselves. The mystery of those final days remains a subject of intense study and lingering questions. How did the infection take hold of Heydrich so quickly? Was there a deeper conspiracy within the ranks of his own party to let him die, removing a rival who was becoming too powerful for even the highest leaders to control? Some suggest that the medical treatment he received was intentionally flawed, a subtle assassination layered on top of a direct one. Others believe it was simply the hand of fate, a poetic justice where the man who treated people like objects was brought down by the very debris of his own luxury. These theories linger in the periphery, adding a layer of intrigue to an already chilling saga. In the end, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich stands as one of the most significant acts of resistance during the conflict. It proved that no one was untouchable, not even the man who held the keys to the most terrifying offices in the world. It showed that even in the heart of an occupied territory, under the most brutal conditions imaginable, the human spirit could find a way to strike back. But it also stands as a testament to the devastating consequences of such defiance. The shadow of the man with the iron heart was long, and it stretched far beyond his grave, touching the lives of thousands who never knew his name until the moment their world was torn apart. The thriller of Prague is not just about a car on a hairpin turn or a gun that jammed at the worst possible moment. It is about the choices made in the dark, the weight of responsibility, and the terrifying speed at which the world can change. It is a story that asks us what we would be willing to sacrifice if the world we knew was being dismantled piece by piece. The Butcher of Prague is a figure of history, but the darkness he represented is something that requires constant vigilance, a reminder that the silence of a desk can be just as deadly as the roar of a cannon. Today, the green Mercedes is a ghost of the past, and the names of Gabčík and Kubiš are etched in bronze. The city of Prague has reclaimed its beauty, the gold reflecting off the Vltava River as if the shadows of 1942 were never there. But for those who know where to look, the marks of the struggle are everywhere. They are in the chipped stone of the church, the quiet grass of Lidice, and the unsettling feeling that history is never truly settled. The story of the man with the iron heart is a journey into the depths of human capability, both for evil and for the courage required to end it. The echoes of that morning in May still ripple through time, serving as a chilling narrative of what happens when the world's most calculated mind meets the world's most desperate resolve. It is a dark thriller that did not end with a funeral, but with a transformation of the human landscape, leaving behind a legacy of questions that we are still trying to answer. The Butcher of Prague was a man of numbers and icy, detached cruelty, but he was ultimately reminded that history is not written by the man behind the desk. It is written by those willing to step into the road and change the world, no matter how much the darkness threatens to push back.